Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today is Friday, October 3rd. We're moving into the fall and autumn here with our WACO meetings. Today we have a very timely topic of interest, and that is a drought update. But first, I'd like to ask for announcements and introductions from the floor. Is there anyone in the room who would like to introduce themselves to the group? New members, friends, family? The Pledge of Allegiance. Thank you. I've forgotten. Mr. Collins, would you please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
As we say these 31 words, think what they mean to your life on a daily basis. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, Mr. Collins. Announcements and introductions. Anybody from the floor would like to introduce themselves? Any new members? Anybody? Seeing no takers. So that will lead us on to Ms. Ackerman with the Metropolitan Water District report. Linda.
Thank you, and of course I just put a bite of bagel in my mouth. Good morning. I missed seeing all of you for the past 2 months. I've been missing. But I am back. You've heard that before. First and foremost, I'd like to welcome and introduce to you, even though you know him, our newest Metropolitan director from representing, I should say, MWDOC, Mr. Larry McKinney. And Larry, you're in here, I know. I'm looking forward to working with Larry and he's looking forward to representing all of you at Metropolitan. I was on vacation this month, however, I did manage to make it to the Metropolitan Committee meetings on the 8th, two of which I sit upon. At the Water Planning and Stewardship Committee meeting last month, the board authorized an improvement of the return capacity of the semi-tropic groundwater storage program. This basin, as many of you know, is northwest of Bakersfield. This agreement will increase our acre-feet of storage capacity there from 225,000 acre-feet to 350,000 acre-feet. Met's projected return from this storage in 2014 is expected to be 37,000 acre-feet. This committee and the board also approved a fully reimbursable, not to exceed $20 million in funding agreement with the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power for potential groundwater recovery projects there in Los Angeles. This will be a pay-as-you-go arrangement, as I said, fully reimbursable with Metropolitan, and it will certainly enhance their local water supply. We also had a very thorough presentation regarding Met's local resources program and refinements to that, to the LRP. The highlights of these refinements are a proposed increase in the current incentive in an amount up to $250 per acre-foot of water produced to an amount up to $340 per acre-foot of water produced. We also discussed they proposed three different incentive payment structures, two that feature sliding payment scales with a difference in length of years for the project, and a third which features a fixed incentive payment. This is an agenda item for our meeting in October this month. All of these options will be vetted and voted on then. We will also have an agenda item that will be discussed and voted on regarding an agreement with the California Department of Water Resources to purchase surface water supplies from the Yuba County Water Agency and to appropriate funds for water transfer payments from the Water Management Fund. Metropolitan had a record-breaking $81.4 million in conservation rebate requests as of our last meeting. We have committed to $37 million after they were approved. $5.2 million has actually been paid on turf removal. We had a thorough presentation and overview of our water supply allocation plan, and this discussion will continue at the October board meeting. Metropolitan and their staff are actively involved with all of its member agencies regarding this plan. The board also voted to support Prop 1, which is the water bond. That was unanimously supported. An update on BDCP. Because of comments submitted by the EPA, we don't expect a final decision on the EIR EIS until early next year. Cost allocation discussions regarding the project are still ongoing. Contractors had a meeting scheduled for September 23. I assume they did that. So we should be seeing something from that meeting soon. In an August report, the Bureau of Reclamation updated its outlook for potential shortage and storage on the Colorado River. Based on their forecasting models, 68%, they estimate a 60% chance of a shortage declared on the river by 2018, and only a 7% chance of a surplus over the same time frame. It is interesting to note that to date, there's never been a shortage imposed by the Bureau on the river. That's it for this morning, except of course for my ever more difficult to find strange fact about water. And this one I'm not even going to ask you if you can guess. Did you know that it takes 6 gallons of water per day to grow just one, medical marijuana plant? Perhaps this is not a good time for a discussion about the legalization of the plant, because the legal one needs the same amount of water.
Thank you very much, Linda. We always love those water facts. Mr. Swan, you have the Aqua report.
Okay, thank you very much. Linda, is that why my water bill's going up? Thank you very much. A goodly number of you went to the MWDOC dinner last night. You saw John Coleman. He gave an update on what Aqua's done. I thought that was a pretty good update, very good dinner. In addition to that, there are a number of regional activities going on, including the regional, 8, 9, and 10 conference that will be held in San Diego on the 26th and 27th. That's a Sunday and Monday. It includes a tour of the newly constructed or reconstructed San Vicente Dam. And the topic is, where do we go from here? How do we cope with another year? In addition, there are other regional meetings that may be of interest. I encourage people who can and have the time and wherewithal to go and try some of them. One of them will be up at a conference up in Livermore. That will be on the 19th and 20th, the week before. It will look at some of the facilities along the State Water Project, Lake Duval, and the pumping station, and some of the things that they're doing to cope. And it will give you, if you go there, you'll get a perspective from Northern California, how they see the drought, and it might be informative. They also plan, as a get-together on Sunday evening, a visit to one of the local establishments, one of the wineries up in the area, so that might be added incentive. Other than that, I'll answer any questions that you have, or you can talk to me afterwards, after the meeting. Thank you very much.
This morning we have a very timely topic, and that is a drought update and an update on the 2014 water bond, which will now be known as Proposition 1. Today our speaker is Kathleen Cole, Executive Legislative Representative for the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. She's charged with managing the district's state legislative program in Sacramento. Talk about a big job. That has to be one of the biggest. Ms. Cole has been with the agency for 23 years and is responsible for promoting and protecting Metropolitan's state legislative objectives, working closely with the board, General Manager Jeff Keitlinger, his management team, and the district's contract lobbyists in Sacramento. I can't imagine the number of shifting and moving priorities. It must be a very fluid environment that she works in. Prior to her joining Metropolitan, Kathy was a registered lobbyist and office manager for Lynn Suter & Associates, a private advocacy firm which focused primarily on local government issues. She cut her teeth on legislative issues through 2 years with the state legislative operation for East Bay Municipal Utility District. Kathleen, are you in the room?
I am.
There you are.
I haven't left the building.
Welcome and thank you for being here today.
Good morning, everyone. So good to see you all. Let me get myself situated here. Great setup up here. I like this. It's very cool. Well, good morning. Good to see so many familiar faces and some new faces. It's been a while since I've been down here at WACO, so I appreciate the invitation. And up front, I want to apologize. Some of you that were at the policy dinner, John Coleman scooped me last night. So I'm going to repeat some of the general topics that Mr. Coleman spoke to the group about last night. But I will probably get into a little bit more of the detail than he was able to do before the dinner audience last evening. So I appreciate it. Bear with me here. Let's get going. All right. So we have concluded the 2013-14 legislative session. They did adjourn a day early. They were supposed to adjourn on August 31st and ended up closing the doors on the 30th after working basically 2 weeks straight, floor sessions all day long. And when all was said and done, the total of the bills passed by the legislature to Governor Brown was a little under 1,100 bills. The governor actually vetoed a little over 13% of those bills. Wasn't the highest rate of vetoes that he had during his term so far, the second go around. But he did make some changes to what the legislature had sent to him in the closing days. There were 120 new statutes added to the California Water Code. And so out of those bills that he did sign, we've got 120 new water laws. But without a doubt, this was a big year for water policy. We were able to accomplish some pretty big ticket items this last year, and it's a track record that the legislature, the governor, as well as the water industry should be very proud of. Started off the early part of the year, February and March, recognizing that we were in a pretty serious drought and looking like it was going to be with us for a while. They passed 2 measures to provide some expedited funding and some policy relief to deal with the immediate impacts of the drought. And as part of the many bills that were passed and signed into law, we do also have some new measures on water use efficiency and water recycling. There were 6 measures that Metropolitan followed and supported through the process. 3 measures having to do with common interest developments, HOAs, if you will, and how they, their policies and documents, guidelines govern water use in their communities during a gubernatorial declared drought. There's also now a new bill that the governor signed that creates what we call the Cal Conserve program. This is a bill actually Metropolitan and the California Municipal Utilities Association sponsored in 2013. Assemblyman Gatto decided to revisit the issue in 2014, and we were able to get it across the finish line. The governor signed it. This is a bill to create a state revolving fund for low interest or no interest loans for water use efficiency. Public agencies are the recipients of those funds, but the bill's created so that it can create some financing opportunities for the private sector. Commercial, industrial, big ticket water use efficiency projects, recycling projects. This hopefully will be a financing tool to make those projects come to reality. Plus, Mr. Gatto carried a bill for looking at building standards for recycled water, timing it with the code update that the Building Standards Commission will be doing in the next couple of years. And also another bill that helped incentivize turf removal programs. There was some uncertainty whether or not turf rebates, the incentive programs that the region is now offering to our communities, whether or not that was taxable under California state law. AB 2434 by Mr. Gomez clarified that it's not taxable under state law, the receipt of those incentives. So that's definitely a plus that we were able to get across the finish line. And then, of course, the water bond, which I'll cover here shortly. Groundwater management was a big ticket item, heavy lift at the end of session. If there's time, I'm happy to kind of run through some slides on that. And there's also 3 measures now on the books to modernize Urban Water Management Planning Act. So if your agency probably will need to take a look at those 3 bills and make sure that they're up to speed on the changes to the Act requirements. So moving to the drought. This was definitely a driver for public policy debate in Sacramento this year. And it's depicted pretty clearly here on the impacts we're facing this year in California with respect to our water supply. So these pictures demonstrate the severity of this year's drought. As you can see, in the left picture. It was the snow that had covered the Sierras back in 2013. And on the right, the photo from 2014 demonstrates the dramatic reduction in the amount of snowpack from a statewide average of 115% in 2013 to 15% in 2014. So I think that pretty well sums up what kind of conditions we've got going on as far as the supply. Nationally, we're not alone. Other parts of certainly the Southwest have been severely impacted by dry conditions, as reflected on this drought watch map as of September 2nd. And a little closer to home, we certainly in California have been experiencing exceptionally dry conditions this year. It's California's third consecutive dry year with record temperatures of 4.7 degrees hotter than the statewide average. And for this region, 5.7 degrees hotter than the average that has been experienced in Southern California today. California began the new water year, which started October 1st, with a total reservoir capacity of just 36%. So we are amongst one of the 4 driest years on record, first being 1977, 1924, 1931, and 2014. So we are setting records. And this slide shows you how it's impacted the entire state from 2011 over the last 3 years and the impacts on how. Let me see if I can play that again. I think that's pretty, I guess I'm not going to be able to play that again. It shows you how more and more areas of the state started facing severe dry conditions. And so we're at this point now that we have abnormally dry conditions pretty much statewide. And I know many of you have experienced the State Water Project inspection trip that MWDOC and Met have hosted, and you're very familiar with Lake Oroville if you've done that trip. So these slides show the status of Lake Oroville back in 2011 and now in 2014. As you know, Lake Oroville is on the headwaters of the State Water Project. It's the reservoir which supplies water to the project. So you can see the difference in the water supply levels this year. The drought led to an unprecedented reduction in deliveries from the State Water Project to just 5%. So in 2014, Metropolitan estimates that we are going to experience about a 1 million acre-feet shortfall in imported and local supplies. And the estimated shortfall will need to be supplied from the reservoirs and the investments that our ratepayers have made in Southern California to deal with times like this. So in 2014, our board took several actions in response to the drought, including we doubled our investment in conservation from $20 to $40 million, including implementing a $5.5 million outreach and conservation education campaign. We moved water from our groundwater banking and storage programs inside and outside our service area, deferred capital projects to facilitate deliveries. We actually had to modify our distribution system to move Colorado River water to areas of our service water that were being served exclusively State Water Project water. And so these actions are built on years of investments by Metropolitan and member agencies that we made to develop storage facilities such as Diamond Valley Lake. I think that really saved our bacon in times like this. And it's also helped to serve water supply to the service area during this very, very dry year. So that was a critical investment that proved to be well worth its cost. All right, water bond, moving on to the water bond. The water bond isn't probably going to actually deal with the current drought because by the time you get projects up and going and that the voters hopefully will give it the thumbs up on November 4th. But it is a package, a framework, if you will, that can really help drought-proof the state for future dry and uncertain times. So the framework, we believe, certainly reflects the fiscal limitations of California at a time when significant water investments are acutely needed. And the funding, as you can see in this pie chart here, closely matches the needs of metropolitan service area, while investments in statewide system water reliability will provide both environmental and supply benefits. I provided, and I think they're over there on the table, we have a new leave behind, 2-pager, front and back, that Metropolitan's External Affairs under the leadership of Dee Zink, who's over there against the wall, that I think will be a good talking point for you all to use in your communities. It shows the the benefits of the bond potentially for Southern California. We've tried to identify areas of funding that could really help move the ball here in our region. And also, I know that last week, WACO released its second toolkit on the bond, which has a lot of very good materials in it. If you don't have a copy of that, let me know. I'll be sure to send you one. It's PowerPoints, talking points, leave-behinds, background, the do's and don'ts for public agencies on the water bond. So I do urge you to take a look at that toolkit. I think that would be a very helpful resource for you as well. So a little blast to the past really quickly. The history of the water bond, it was $11.14 billion general obligation bond passed by the legislature back in 2009 as part of a 5-bill package that the legislature approved back then. And that was done under the leadership of Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. And then fast forward, it was supposed to be on the 2010 ballot. Governor Brown's elected into office, started making some noise that, geez, that bond's awfully big. I don't know that I can rally behind an $11 billion bond of that magnitude. A lot of discussion in the legislature looking at where we were economically as a state. The legislature, governor decided, let's kick it down the road a bit. They scheduled it to 2012. And then again, we weren't quite out of the economic quagmire that we found ourselves in, not only state but nationally. So the legislature kicked it down the road again to 2014, in light of that continued concerns about the economy. So it was delayed several times, and then this past year became the year that they really had to kind of step up and figure out what they could do with a bond of that magnitude. Back in 2013, our board of directors actually acknowledging that we had to do something about the bond, and in order to position ourselves for discussions and negotiations on it, our board adopted a set of policy priorities that gave me my marching orders in Sacramento during discussions on the bond. Real quickly here, funding the state's share of the public benefits to support the co-equal goals. That was one of our top priorities. Funding the public benefits associated with Delta sustainability. Funding multi-benefit projects to reduce future reliance on the Delta, a very key component of the 2009 Delta Reform Act. And recognizing that we really need to invest in the backbone infrastructure of the state of California. So needed to have some sort of funding sources to develop surface and groundwater projects throughout the state. So, long and short of it, we spent a good part in the early part of the year talking about what to do with the bond. Assemblymember Rendon, who chairs the Water, Parks, and Wildlife Committee, was on the road, having field hearings, trying to get input and feedback from communities around the state on what they thought their bond priorities were. There were a number of informational hearings held in the legislature. But when all was said and done, when the governor released his $6 billion plan at the end of June, signaling $11 billion, way too high, I'm willing to do maybe half of that, that really kick-started the negotiations with the legislative leadership and Governor Brown. And after they came back from their summer recess, they had agreed on a package that ended up going into 2 measures. They were identical in content, SB 866 by Lois Wolk and AB 1471 by Mr. Rendon. And as you can see there by the vote count, it was overwhelmingly a bipartisan vote, passage of the both vehicles. The governor actually signed 1471 on August 13th, and which took off the $11.14 billion bond off the ballot and replaced it with this new revised version of a bond. And it's going to be Prop 1 on the November 4th ballot. So a little quickly on what's in it. I want to review the contents with you and certainly be available to answer any questions you might have on any of the particular chapters. But as I mentioned, this does replace the bond that was on the ballot previously. It authorizes a little over $7 billion in new debt. So it's $7.12 billion, and $425 million of that is going to be repurposed from other previously approved bond measures that the voters have approved in past years. For example, Prop 84, Prop 50, Prop 13. I mean, they go way back to even Prop 82 and 44 from days gone by. These were dollars that were not being, they were authorized by the voters back in the day, but the projects that the dollars were targeted for never materialized, or they proved not to be, worth making the investment, the state investment towards those projects. So once the voters approve a block of funds for a certain purpose, if you're going to change that purpose, you've got to go back to the voters to ask their okay to redirect it for other purposes. So that's what the repurposing is doing. It wasn't any dollars that were already targeted for projects that you all might be interested in. This is money that was it was authorized by the voters. You know, the bonds weren't sold, but they needed to repurpose in order to put together the $7.545 billion package. Generally speaking, there's language in the bond, throughout the bond, that says, you know, thou shalt not use any of these funds to build new Delta conveyance tunnels, the infrastructure, the tunnel project that we are looking at under BDCP. It did have language in it, does have language in it though, that says all that good policy that happened back in 2009, the co-equal goals, the Delta levy prioritization, all that still stands. So it like recasts some of those very key provisions back from 2009. And the eligible applicants, the pool of agencies that can compete for these funds include public agencies, nonprofits, public utilities, tribes, and mutual water companies. Another special feature of this, because this was a big deal for Mr. Rendon, was to make sure there were no earmarks. We all remember from the 2009 bill, there was a lot of concern about the pork or project funding that was identified for particular projects without being open to a competitive process. I can say that this bill and the bond that's on the ballot in November is really a competitive opportunity for agencies to apply for funds and may the best project be funded. There's language in there that says projects that leverage non-state funds are given a kind of a thumbs up, a little priority consideration in the bond. So if you have a project that you're bringing some local dollars, maybe some federal dollars to the table, you'll be given a higher consideration than projects that don't have those resources available to them. And there's an express recognition, protection of existing water rights, and area of origin protection. That was in the 09 bond, and it's certainly in this one as well. So getting into the actual funding specifics, run through very quickly. Chapter 5, this is the Clean, Safe, Reliable Drinking Water chapter. $260 million split for small community wastewater systems, and then $260 million split for drinking water public infrastructure improvements. Generally, this chapter was targeted for the disadvantaged communities, those communities that have systems out of compliance, that don't have the resources by which to bring them up to speed. So this was kind of the focus of this particular chapter. Chapter 6. This is actually a pretty important chapter for Metropolitan's objectives on the Delta. As I mentioned, there's no funding for the Delta tunnels, but it does include funding to advance the co-equal goals that were specified back in 2009. So to the extent there's projects that move forward with some of these funds that respond and improve the habitat and the environment for listed fish species, that will help state water project deliveries by reducing further regulatory constraints on exports that may be imposed by permits by the State Board, Fish and Wildlife, or the federal fish agencies. But this bond is clearly different than the 09 bond because there was clear funding for the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. And the governor and the legislative leadership didn't want this bond to become a fight over the tunnel project. So that's the BDCP tunnel neutrality bumper sticker that they were all committed to and wanted to make sure that the final product didn't raise the shackles of opposition to the tunnel project. But I got to say too, the Bay Delta Conservation Plan's approval is not predicated on passage of funds from a bond this year. Remember, it's a 50-year program. We're going to be working with the federal and state administrations to identify potential other funding sources, other bond money, general fund money, other support to move the ecosystem restoration component of BDCP forward. And then lastly on this slide, the $327.5 million for the 10 named state conservancies and Ocean Protection Council. It's broken up by 10 various conservancies. Funding will go for those particular activities. The line item that's allocated for those particular named conservancies will be competitive within that particular conservancy service area. Chapter 7, $810 million for regional water supply reliability. This is a big chapter for Southern California. $510 million in new money for integrated regional water management, which I know this county is very active in. That's in addition to the $400 million That was expedited in the drought relief package earlier in the year. So there's about, a little under $1 billion for integrated regional water management programs if the bond should pass. And I know DWR has just released its potential awards of $200 million from Prop 84 IRWM, and they're going to be doing another round early next spring. So there's some considerable funding potential for the IRWM program. Also want to mention $200 million standalone outside of IRWM for stormwater capture. So you will be able to compete outside of the IRWM process for stormwater projects as well as water conservation. $100 million for water conservation, standalone outside of IRWM. Big chapter. This was a big focus of discussion during the legislative debate, the storage chapter. When all was said and done, the governor and the legislative leadership agreed to $2.7 billion continuously appropriated to the Water Commission for surface and groundwater storage projects around the state. The eligible projects are the usual cast of characters in the surface, groundwater storage, conjunctive use, reservoir re-op. There is language that does take Shasta Reservoir off the list of potential projects. There's a wild and scenic designation associated with Shasta, so they want to go down that path and have that fight on the wild and scenic on the McCloud River. But the one test that these projects have to meet, if you're going to qualify for funds through the Water Commission. So the Water Commission is going to come up with a process where they're going to come up with guidelines and regulations to govern what's a public benefit and how project money can be allocated particular projects. So they're going to come up with a very defined regulatory guideline schedule probably by the end of next year, we're hoping. But all the projects have to meet what we call the measurable improvements test. So all storage projects, whether you're groundwater or surface water, have to demonstrate that your project's going to be making measurable improvements to the Delta ecosystem or tributaries in order to qualify for funds. Chapter 9, big chapter here for this county, water recycling, $725 million for potable and non-potable recycling, also salt removal, desalination, and also the infrastructure it takes to get the water from your facilities to your customers. I will say that this chapter, it's grants and loans. It's not all grants on the water recycling chapter. There is language in there that says the state board's share of the funding under the recycling chapter will be handled like they did with Prop 13, which was a split between grants and loans. So it's not all a grant program. Chapter 10, another big category. This is a big issue for Southern California. A lot of our legislators are really committed to the groundwater sustainability chapter, a little under $1 billion for prevention or cleanup of groundwater basins that serve or has served as a drinking water source. So that's a big funding opportunity potentially. And in light of the groundwater management passage, also that followed a couple weeks after the bond passed, there will be $100 million if the voters should approve this bond for helping implement that groundwater management sustainability legislative package. Chapter 11, flood management. Of course, the need is much greater than $395 million if it were to ever rain again. But it is targeted $295 million for the Delta, for Delta levees. As again, I know you've all seen the system down there. It's very vulnerable to flood events, and so they're looking at providing some funding to reinforce that system and some other purposes. And then $100 million for statewide flood management projects, which clearly is not going to address the need, but it's a start. So supporters, this is just a partial list. I'm going to tell you day by day the list is growing. It's a broad list of water agencies, business community folks, environmental organizations, the labor trades, and agriculture. They are supporting the bond because it will ensure a reliable water supply for farms and businesses and to support our economy. It does have language, as I mentioned, to safeguard existing water supplies. Storage is a big component, and if there's anything that we've witnessed, certainly in Southern California, how storage has really helped us weather the drought we're facing. So there's some significant investment towards storage. The opposition is out there. It's not going to be a slam dunk. There is some opposition out there, primarily from interest in the South and Central Delta. Food and Water Watch. Restore the Delta's been pretty active on it, been having some events around the state. Southern California Watershed Alliance is opposed. For the reasons, they say they prefer the beneficiary pays approach to funding infrastructure, that they think this is a way to usher in new big dam development throughout the state. They see that there's very little relief on the drought as a result of the funding that would be available if this bond should pass. And they say it's a hogfest of projects unrelated to water supply or drought relief. And the pro and con arguments that I have on these slides are pulled right out of the ballot arguments that have been published by the Secretary of State. Sustainability Act of 2014, and I gotta say, this was truly historic. This was big. And as you all have heard, and it was reported in the paper, up until the end of the session, California was the only Western state without state enforceable standards for groundwater management. You know, we're very progressive in a lot of areas, but we were the only state that didn't have a formal groundwater management structure. And this comes from a long history of talking about it, but not being able to get anything over the finish line. Back in 1962, the legislature was advised by a commission that it better take some action on groundwater management in the state or the situation is going to worsen. So that was back many, many years ago. It started identifying potential problems in our groundwater basins. Almost before mine. And then the governor, in his first ride back in 1978, formed a commission to review California's water rights. And the commission reported back that they said, hey, this groundwater situation is critical. And unless there's some comprehensive local management of our basins, we're going to have further degradation of the basins in California, and we're going to have some major problems on our hands. So then 2014, and the media really picked up on the drought. We're looking up subsidence, the health of groundwater basins, particularly in the Central Valley, San Joaquin Valley. A lot of press reports and stories, or legislative hearings. We had several during the early part of the year. And when all was said and done, and the drought certainly refocused the attention on overdrafted basins in California. And as the hearings and the discussion and the dialogue and the media reports and the drought continued to persist, that really, I think, drove the legislature to want to tackle this very thorny issue. So how this year started out, the California Water Foundation, Lester Snow, and you all remember Lester Snow as a former director of water resources. He heads up the California Water Foundation. They were asked by Governor Brown to initiate a stakeholder process and to get folks around the table to talk about what's going on groundwater perspective. The bills were introduced in February, to two bills, the Pavley and the Dickinson bill, which I'll cover here shortly. And then in April 2014, at the direction of now our chairman, but then president of WACO, Randy Record, he directed his board to come up with a groundwater task force and to put together some recommendations for achieving groundwater sustainability. So they released the report in April, and I got to say that really kind of changed the dynamic. The legislature was like, wow, you know, we would think that WACO would be, you know, kind of opposed to moving forward with comprehensive groundwater management, but they really took the bull by the horns and put out this report and laid out a number of recommendations that caught the legislature's attention in a very positive way. Then the California Water Foundation released their report in May, so we had these two reports that, interestingly enough, had a lot of similarities. Then, as we move through the legislative process, we're getting towards the final months. During the summer recess, Calif PA convened 5 professionally facilitated public meetings. The authors were there, officials from the governor's office were there, DWR, state board, and stakeholders were invited to participate. And a lot of dialogue looking at what needed to be done legislatively. So then when they reconvened after their 1-month summer recess in August, the two bills, SB 1168 and AB 1739, started going through some transformations. Amendments were made throughout the month. If you look at the legislative history, you'll see August was a very busy time for amendments on these two bills. And the whole idea was to incorporate a lot of that feedback they were getting from stakeholders and comments that they were receiving from folks that were interested in the dialogue. So on August 29th, when they were trying to get these bills heard on the floor, There were some last-minute amendments that the administration and Aqua had asked for, so Fran Pavley took one of her bills that she wasn't going to move forward, SB 1319, and added some additional amendments to clarify primarily the state's role as the backstop on this groundwater management, and I'll have a slide on that in just a moment. Unlike the bond, as you can see, there was a little bit of controversy associated with this bond, or this measure. It wasn't a slam dunk. They had to work hard to get their majority vote in both houses on all three bills. But they did pass, and irrespective of the passage, but 24 hours later, a letter went to the governor and legislative leadership from 35 Senate and Assembly members saying, hey, you know, we agree that we've got a problem here, but the threat of state intervention should be an option to motivate better basin management rather than the backstop. The legislative package, they felt, punished users in the basin that have little or no overdraft or already have effective management plans in place. They felt this was a rush job. 3 weeks was not enough, but what I hope my slides tried to demonstrate that this wasn't just a 3-week discussion. It had been going on for quite some time. And they were concerned about radically changing California's groundwater law, and they were urging the governor to veto the package and to call a special session in December to tackle the groundwater discussion again. Supporters, Aqua, as President Coleman mentioned last night, a very active supporter of the groundwater package. Pipes Trade Council, Groundwater Resources Association, Maine San Gabriel Basin Water Master, Nature Conservancy. There were a number of public agencies that came on in support. But there was a fair amount of opposition, and this is just a partial list, primarily from the agricultural industry and growers and the like. So what's in each bill? Generally speaking, the Pavley bill, SB 1168, lays out how groundwater management basin governance should be structured, the requirements for that, what the plan should have in them, and how they should be moving forward towards implementation. 1739, the Dickinson bill, provides for the tools that they need to move forward with implementation as well as enforcement. And then, as I mentioned, 1319 was kind of like a cleanup bill to address some of the concerns that had been expressed by the opposition before the bills got out of the legislature. The focus, however, this package is on high and medium priority basins. So if you're determined by DWR to be a low priority, they are encouraging all basins to adhere to the standards in the bill, but the real focus was on those basins most at risk. The bill lays out some very critical deadlines for coming up with your plans, for achieving, for establishing your basin management authority. It's a 50-year planning horizon, but they want to see under the package sustainable management in basins that are high and medium priority in 20 years after the plan's adopted. Again, this is all about sustainable management of our groundwater by local agencies. That's the first focus. Give it to the locals, give them the tools they need to get the job done, adopt great plans, and you're good to go. It's all about local groundwater management. That's the incentive. You locals take the charge on, do it yourself, come up with a good plan, present it to DWR, and work together to get that thing done. Management's supposed to be based on using best available science, and again, state intervention only when necessary, and there's some very descriptive criteria that I'll cover here shortly on when that happens. So the bills provide what the plans should contain. The basin managers, if there isn't one already established that meets the criteria of the bill, got to be established by June 30th, 2017. So they do allow some time for these plans, the agencies and all to be established. I'll mention here, because this is going to probably be an issue for next year, the second bullet. Water corporations can participate if local agencies approve. So the local public agencies that are forming a groundwater agency, if they are okay with the investor-owned water utilities being part of that plan, then they're in. But it's not a requirement that they're in. So I understand the investor-owned utilities are going to probably take this on next year as an issue. Groundwater basin managers have a number of authorized authorities and powers under the bill. But for us here in Southern California, most of the basins are adjudicated. So this bill says that existing adjudicated basins are basically exempt from the new requirements of the bill, provided those basin water masters provide annual updates to DWR, and, some data collection on elevation of the groundwater and general information that they'll be collecting anyway, probably pursuant to the court orders. But that information needs to be provided for DWR. You do that, you're good to go. And then if you're a statutorily managed basin, which I know that's certainly the case here in this area, your management structure, your sustainability plan can be deemed a functional equivalent or an alternate to the broader requirements if you present that plan to DWR and they look at it and they're good to go. The bill does say you guys got to work with the cities and counties. The land use agencies are an important part of this discussion, so don't leave them out of the mix. And it also exempts plan preparation, if you have to prepare a plan, from CEQA. Not the project or actions under the plan, but definitely the plan itself is exempt from CEQA. This is the slide about when the state intervenes. So there's some very specific instances when if you fail at the local level to put your plan together and get consensus on a sustainable management plan, when the state steps in. And if the state steps in, they can come up with a probationary plan, an interim plan, if you will, giving the chance of the locals to remedy the situation, to provide some relief, to maybe come back together and figure out how they can step up and manage their own basin. Again, the idea, the state doesn't want to get in the business of managing these basins if the locals have the wherewithal to put it all together. Now for Met, we looked at this and we were kind of, I tell folks, we were kind of in the second tier of seats. We were not groundwater managers. We do, involve ourselves in groundwater storage programs, conjunctive use programs inside and outside our service area. So we were looking at this to make sure that those kind of programs were not at risk. And we felt that, generally speaking, we thought as long as groundwater management is an important overall objective that Metropolitan's board has established for many, many years. So long as our agreements were recognized in those basins, we were pretty satisfied with the final language. So long as those existing programs don't interfere with the broader management of the basin, they should be good to go. And we also felt that because we have contracts with our basin partners, that under the California Constitution's Contracts Clause provision, that our agreements, our existing agreements, were probably protected under the new regime. So that was truly, truly historic, and I know it didn't come with a price, as I think you probably heard Director Coleman say. Some of the ACWA members are not happy campers, but I know Tim Quinn and Director Coleman and others on the board are reaching out to their colleagues that have some concern about where this package is going, and hopefully can find some common understanding and implementation. ACWA will be very involved in implementation of these bills, has already given DWR and State Board a heads up that they want to be at the table. So we'll see how this plays out in the months ahead. So where's my
Wow,
card?
what an outstanding presentation on the legislative history on both sides. But Kathy cannot leave because we know there's a lot of questions. So here we go.
Is there a site to download this thing?
Yeah, I'll work with Darcy and we'll get it, it's got so many graphics and I'll probably shut down your own computers. But we'll do a PDF and
Okay,
certainly make it available.
I'm still back on page 3.
I had you at hello, huh?
Introduce yourself.
I was trying to, I think she was pointing over there, you were pointing down.
He's going to be in charge of questions,
No,
I'll
no, no.
answer.
My name is John Collins,
Hi,
I'm
John.
the city council member. I have a couple of quick questions. You mentioned that there's no tunnels going under the delta. Is there any mention of what the delta smelt are going to happen? I mean, can we have a delta smelt fishing contest or something, or maybe get them out of there or something? Is there any referral of that at all? I haven't seen that since the judge made his ruling.
Yeah, there's pending litigation at the federal level on the BIOPS that were governing the operation of the federal and state water projects. So that's outside of the legislature. And
funded by any of this money?
yeah, no.
Even though it would improve, obviously.
The habitat and the environment, yeah. The question, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to repeat the question. The question was regarding, what's being done about the smelt and with respect to the bond. That chapter 6 that has some very extensive funding for ecosystem restoration, watershed improvements. We think whatever you do in the watersheds to improve the habitat and conditions for the fish is going to help ultimately the delta and, as I said, the operation of the project. So there are some, there's funding for enhancing flows for the fish. So the state would potentially go out, purchase water from willing sellers, and be able to use those flows to enhance conditions for the fish. So there are some opportunities in Chapter 6 for that.
What the tunnels were supposed to do is basically bypass the smelt.
That's the theory.
Real fast is that every time I'd like everything that's been mentioned here by you and also in this flyer as far as where the money would be used. But every time you see a bond, no one ever addresses that it is in fact a debt that has to be repaid. Where does the money come from repaying this debt?
The question is, how are the bonds repaid?
Proposition 13.
Actually, this general obligation bonds are the debt service is one of the first priorities of the state of California in their budget process. It'll be a $360 million, should this bond pass, $360 million a year in debt service. That debt service is retired through our payment of income taxes and sales taxes to the state of California.
Okay.
That's the reality.
I won't dig any deeper than that. The last part of my question is that I've seen in here, and it's mentioned in your flyer, and you mentioned it too, about the desalinization and other alternatives, but there's no mention of groundwater replenishment system, GWRS, which is working terrifically for the Orange County area. I don't know where our aquifer would be if we didn't have GWRS inflow into it.
The question was about GWRS-like facilities being potentially funded by this. I believe that the funding under the water recycling chapter can help advance projects much like its successful project in Orange County Water District. I got to say, Orange County Water District and its partners here in Orange County, really your project is set a new standard for Sacramento to realize that we can do more in recycled water to maximize the use of existing supplies. People talk about your project all the time. And you've done a good job at getting that up and running and touting the values and the benefits of that project. So you are to be commended for all that effort. Go ahead. Okay. Mary Eileen.
I'm interested in...
Please introduce yourself.
Oh, Mary Eileen Mathias, Irvine Ranch Water District. I'm interested in Senator Wolf's position and how she satisfied her delta interest, because that was the major stumbling block along the way.
Mary Eileen is asking about Senator Wolf's interest and how she handled all of this bond discussion. Obviously, she's been an advocate for the Delta ever since she first moved to the Assembly, and now that she's in the Senate. Very strong voice, very strong advocate for no tunnels. We got to find another way to move water from north to south, or to create an opportunity that Southern California becomes totally self-dependent without supplies from the Delta. The tunnel neutrality, when the governor stepped up in late June and said, this isn't going to be about the tunnels. I don't want this to be a fight. That's a fight for another day. BDCP planning process is still underway. We don't need to take that fight on in this bond. And so when language was written throughout the bond, thou shalt not use any of these bond funds to build the tunnels, there was some hesitation, though, on that Chapter 6, because that environmental watershed protection funding could help benefit indirectly or directly some investments in the Delta. But she said, well, we got to do something. We're losing the Delta today. Doing nothing is not an option. It's not going to fund the construction of the project. That's a fight for another day. So with those concessions, those language insertions in the bond, she, as you saw, carried one of the bills and has been a strong advocate for Prop 1.
Thank you.
Jim.
Thank you. Would you please give us some insights on how water districts can effectively apply for grants that hopefully will be approved in Prop 1 for regional projects? The process might be helpful for us to get
Good question.
a grip on.
Yeah, I'm no expert on this, but from my 23 years of watching sausage and all being made in Sacramento, the question was, how can agencies best equip themselves to be competitive, to apply for funds should the voters decide to give it the thumbs up in November? Most of the bond programs that you see in my presentation, There's existing programs that have been established by either DWR, State Board, or other agencies. I expect that they will try to rebuild on those existing programs, probably update the guidelines and the regulations that govern the expenditure of those funds. So I don't see that there's going to have to be a lot of new programs created. There's going to be existing venues where they can funnel the money to those particular objectives. So agencies is all competitive, and you're going to have to think multi-project, multi-objective, because those are going to be the ones that are going to, kind of appeal to the administering agencies more than a single focus type project. The more you can show bigger bang for the buck, the more chances I think you have to qualify competitively for those funds. So that's kind of the theme. And leveraging, you bring other funds to the table, that's going to give you a leg up. So leveraging funds, multiple objective, multi-purpose type projects, I think are going to be what the state administrating agencies are going to be looking for. Yes, sir, in the back against the wall.
Ethan Tamani, Mesa Water District. Just curious if you have any information you can share with us in regards to polling on the bond.
Yes, good question. Polling on the bond. The governor's pollster a couple weeks ago finished up a poll over the weekend, and he was pretty encouraged by the results they were seeing without much background of those phone surveys and all. And they did a pretty good sampling of eligible voters likely to vote on November. 57% yes, 27% no. When they were actually read the ballot label, it went up a point, 58%. I think generally, and I'm not a campaign expert, but generally campaign folks like to see numbers in the 60s. So this is without a campaign, right? So they were feeling pretty good. And the polling they had done, and WACO had done earlier in the year, demonstrated that the governor's support is key. If the governor's behind this, the folks out in the real world are going, he's fiscally responsible, he doesn't like a big bond, he's willing to put his support and weight behind this bond, then it must be okay. So the governor is going to be very, very active as much as he can, because he's also on the ballot, so you have to be careful how you make your public appearances on that. But he's very committed to being key, and he is one of 4 members on the campaign team. There is a yes and a no campaign up. The yes on Props 1 and 2 has a website. They're looking and trying to raise funds for the election, and as we know, we've got a little over a month, tomorrow, just a month before the election. So you can bet your bottom dollar you're going to see some mailers and some ads at the last part of this month. They wanted to raise $20 to $23 million in a pretty short time. Oh, I will say, the campaign committee is both Props 1 and Props 2. It's not just a Prop 1 campaign effort. Governor's office wanted to combine the two. He sees some relationship to. Prop 2 is the rainy day fund that was really important to him, and he negotiated a compromise with the legislature. So the campaign committee is both Prop 1 and 2. But so far, the initial polling without a lot of out there is encouraging, but certainly not where I'd want to be if I wanted to feel really good about it. Yes, Rob.
Rob Hunter, MWDOC. Kathy, thanks for being here today. Great
Thank you for the invite.
I'm intrigued by the Hogsfest comment. Knowing that one person's pork is another person's beef, and that this
nice.
Been split
the other
down
one
by about a third. What was removed between the two?
Good question. Rob had asked what out of the prior bond, the $11 billion package, was removed from the current package. And I got to say, and I lived through this in 2009, within less than 24 hours, the bond went from $8 billion to $11.14 billion. Yeah. And why? Because it was, let's make a deal. And members were saying, I could really use X dollars for this project in my district. Can you create an opportunity for me to see it in the bond so I can, encourage support for it in my own district? So it got pretty laden with particular projects, not completely, but it was a mechanism of getting enough votes to get it over the finish line. So there were some carve-outs for, and I can't remember, maybe there's others in the room can remember something in particular. Yeah, there was some specific project, really limited wording that would mean only one project could probably qualify for those funds. And that was kind of sprinkled throughout the bond. But this bond, I gotta say, I've worked on a lot of water bonds in my career. This bond is really a water bond, and it's a competitive process. And it's kind of exciting to see how clean it is, because that doesn't always happen when it comes time to putting a comprehensive package together like what they did in the legislature this year. Let me get Pierre?
Kathy, I'm a great supporter of the bond, but you know, we're going to hear some bad things about the bond, and you saying that there's no earmarks, but you know, number one, I'd like you to explain the LA River, you know, deal. Number two, we should be aware that there are funding already built into the bond for the state agencies to keep them alive and funded. And the third thing I'd like you to do is explain more about storage. You sort of glossed over that when you said it had to be helpful to the Delta, or some words to that effect. So if you would explain those so the people in this room who are going to encounter this, you know, would be able to, you know, explain away some of these things.
Thank you, Pierre. I'm going to say the first one. The port.
LA River.
Okay, LA River. This is my message on the LA River and how it's characterized. It's competitive within the LA River constituency. So they are, if the bond should pass, they have a certain amount of funding directed to projects within the LA River watershed. So within that watershed, they will compete for the funds that are designated in the bond. So it's competitive within the mini region, I guess.
$500 million.
Yeah.
Okay.
And your other question was about the storage chapter. What was the one before that?
Well, there's a certain amount of money in for state agencies that
Oh, yes.
are hardwired in.
In the bond, as there have been in every bond before it, there's language in there that recognizes, you know, it's not without some cost of resources, people, resources, and time by the state agencies to administer bond programs. So in the bond itself, it designates that there should be a 5% set aside out of the bond funds in the various categories for the administering agency to run the program. And we're hoping, you know, with that they don't tap into bond funds for their O&M, that the bond funds that are outside of that administrative cost will be for projects. But it is not a cheap proposition for agencies to run bond programs, so it does provide some funding for them to do a good job updating their guidelines and their regulations and getting the dollars out the door. And storage. So I put up that slide again. That last bullet is there's very clear language in the storage chapter that a project needs to demonstrate measurable improvements to the Delta ecosystem or tributaries. What will happen? Continuous appropriation, I don't know if I elaborate on that. This means that none of that $2.7 billion goes through the state budget process every year. That $2.7 billion, after the treasurer sells the bonds, will go directly to the California Water Commission to allocate towards projects. For those of you familiar with transportation, it's like the CTC. CTC gets a block of funds from the state. They go through a process by which to award projects based on criteria that the CTC has established. The Water Commission is going to have a bigger role, more important role in bond administration. As I mentioned, they're going to come up with some guidelines and regulations. They have some draft guidelines actually out on their website. They'll start to finalize those once the bond passes. By the end of next year, I think they hope to have the public benefit criteria defined. But one of the public benefit criteria they're going to have to factor in as they're weighing the validity and competitiveness of projects, looking at a particular project, can that project proponents demonstrate that this is going to make some measurable, and that's the key word, measurable improvements on the Delta. The Commission's going to have to come up with what does that mean and how are they going to gauge whether or not there's measurable improvements in the Delta.
But what about priorities for the Calif reservoirs?
The Calif reservoirs are certainly eligible. They are, you know, listed specifically that they're eligible for that. I know Temperance Flat and sites are going through a EIR process, a lot of local involvement. We're going to see whether or not those projects actually have some future And they would be able to compete for funding as well from this. But there's also groundwater storage projects, other surface water storage projects throughout the service areas in California that want to be eligible for some of those funds. So we'll see how far 2.7 billion goes. Larry McKinney.
Now, before Larry starts, I'm going to take a prerogative. I'd like to find out who he's representing today. The
man who wears many hats.
I was going to say, Larry McKinney, I have many different roles. Today I'm still moving up.
Okay.
Kathy, thanks for being here. You're the very best. And I want to call on your 20-plus years you said of experience. So you started with this when you were 10, I know.
I did, right out of elementary school.
We started this year, a lot of us saying that this was going to be the year for water in the legislature, and there's been a ton of work done. But can you use your experience and sort of put this in perspective? How big of a year has this been, and do you have any early predictions for what's going to happen next year?
Thank you. So he's asking me to sum up the year in review. How does this stack up to the other water policy years we've had? This is definitely one for the books. I would say when the QSA legislation was hot and heavy back in 2002-05, that was a big moment, right? You know, I see a lot of nodding heads. And I had the pleasure of working on that with Metropolitan. 2009 was huge. I was exhausted. Everybody was exhausted. It was a big deal. And getting that policy on how to find a sustainable delta was, I never thought that I'd see it in my lifetime. You know, people get down in their bunkers and get very parochial about what they can do on water policy with respect to their district. To his credit, Senator Darrell Steinberg, who will soon be out of office, his term is about ready to close, really took it for the team, recognizing that his local Sacramento constituents were not fans of the 2009. He took a big picture vision that we really need to do something on a broad perspective. And he may have a little buyer's remorse now, especially as he's looking for maybe where he's going to go next. But I think generally he knows in his heart of hearts, because he's a policy wonk, that we did the right thing in 09. So that was another huge year. This year is huge. The groundwater, the bond, all in a month, you know, coming together, although it took many months to get to that point. I think this is definitely a look at this year will go down in the history books as a very important year for water. Next year, it's not election year, which always means there could be some havoc. We're going to have new members, people in the legislature that have never been in the legislature before. So we're going to have to start the Water 101 all over again. I do anticipate we're going to see more on the groundwater piece. You know, we're going to talk about implementation. There's some cleanup issues that they're going to want to try to tackle. After the bill, after the dust settles on all the language in the bill, then people undoubtedly go, well, you know, we should probably tweak this, fix this. I know there's going to be an effort to try to come up with language to adjudicate or expedite adjudicated basins. How they do that's obviously going to be important, so that's going to be an issue that's going to come back up next year. Fran Pavley announced it on the floor when she presented her bills. Groundwater recharge is a beneficial use. That may be another issue that we're going to have to tackle. Sounds good, sounds like mom and apple pie, but if you're a downstreamer and upstreamers, you got some potential consequences there. So how you work this is going to be key.
Explain that.
Unfortunately, Pierre asked me to explain this. I'm not an attorney, so anybody want to take it on? There's some interest in the Sac Valley that they want to be able to kind of circumvent some of the state board's discretion on when you can store groundwater in your basins. And for us, as downstream users, we're concerned about upstreamers using some of our stored water to recharge and put into their basins. So we're going to have a little bit of I think the attorneys are going to get rich on this one. We're going to have to get a lot of legal counsel on it. Stephanie Morris, General Counsel of the State Water Contractors, is on it on behalf of the export interest. We had some attorneys early in the year through the AQUA process try to promote some bill language that was very problematic. We stepped up, we're kind of the skunk at the picnic by identifying some potential problems with it. But in the end, we agreed, let's keep working on it. There should be a way to thread this needle, but right now we haven't found one. So we're going to continue to work on that over the next several months. As I mentioned earlier, whether or not water utilities, the investor-owned types, can participate in groundwater plans, that's going to probably be an issue. The Delta, in a perfect world, I wish the legislature would stay out of it. But I'm not likely to see that. With BDCP, deadlines, next summer, potentially for a final record of decision. You know as well as I know, the Delta opponents are going to see that this is our last time to strike. We were able to push back some bills that would have given the legislature more authority over BDCP. Last spring, we were able to defeat a Fraser bill. He didn't even decide to take it up for hearing because many of you helped us oppose that bill. So I expect that the Delta is definitely going to be on the horizon because of the timing. Prop 218, interesting enough, is getting more attention on some of the restrictions of Prop 218 bears on water agencies' ability to invest in their infrastructure. Been part of some preliminary discussions on that. The California Water Action Plan, that's the governor's investment strategy for the next 4 years of his maybe new term, and how California should manage its water supply sustainably for the long haul. Water Energy Nexus, a lot of talk about that in the regulatory circles. The California Energy Commission, State Board, CARB, the PUC, all have processes to look at the relationship between energy and the energy it takes to move water from point A to point B. So whether they just leave it to the regulatory environment or decide to bring it forward to the legislature, we'll see about that. Some discussion about a loading order for water. Kind of have to deal with that as well. And then the age-old, can we do anything on secret reform? I think there's some new members that were voted in last election that really see CEQA as being, now that we've lived with it for many, many, many years, there's some necessary reforms that should be put forward. There's a general feeling with the change in leadership in the Senate in particular that maybe there's a chance to do something. So those are kind of my dust off the crystal ball and look at next year.
What I'd like to do is have Kathy Green join you.
Okay.
You can take a breath a little bit. And Kathy's going to talk about her involvement and maybe thoughts of the Orange County Water District
Absolutely.
on the groundwater.
Okay.
Kathy and I are on Aqua State Ledge together. Kathy is one of the hardest workers in that entire board. It was very volatile this year. When we talked about the bond, there was a lot of give and take, a lot of some anger, some people who are really pushing through, this is it, if we're ever going to do something. And for the first time in Orange County Water District's history, we voted to support the water bond. That has never happened before. So when we started this process, I honestly thought, no way, it just is not going to happen. We've been through this process before, over and over, and it just didn't look like it was going to happen. And at the last minute, it was pulled out, and I think we honestly have a true water bond. It's not going to be perfect for everyone, it never is, but as Ken Calvert told us last month, this is probably the best we're going to have. So we went with that. On the groundwater sustainability, that was rocky, and that went to the last minute. And I was on State Ledge, but I have to give kudos to our staff member, Adam Hutchinson, who had never gotten involved in a political process at all. And he was working with the legislators. Remember, when that groundwater, I don't know if you heard what Kathy said, when that bill started, it was for adjudicated basins. Orange County Water District, our basin is non-adjudicated. We were out of the running before we even started. So there were lots of problems, lots of worries. poor Kathy and the staff, I kept sending them things that were really worrying me and things that we wanted to change. And as Kathy said, this wasn't quite what their bailiwick was, but she saw how important it was, certainly for everyone in this room, and even you. But I mean, the fact of the matter is theirs is imported water, ours is our basin. And amazingly enough, with few exceptions, Sacramento and agriculture were probably our holdouts, but even people were just holding their nose and saying, okay, go for it, we'll support it. And during that whole process, both on the bond and on groundwater replenishment, IRWD was right there. Christine and Paul were right there. Stacy was right there. So state ledge, where you have us as representatives, it's very interesting what a learning process it is. It's and Kathy would tell me to calm down, and I would take a deep breath and try, and we would come back in 2 or 3 weeks and start all over again, and it was completely different. I've never had so many phone calls, so many conference calls, so many trips, so many everything. And I think that we really did a good job for you. I think it's not perfect for everyone, but doggone, we did really well. I'm really proud of it this time. And thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions.
Yes, sir. I know I should know you. Yeah, that's right. I knew I should know you. Go ahead.
Just for Mason Water District, first of all, thanks for the great presentation.
You're welcome.
I want to let you know that Mason Water District is long recognized as one of the most knowledgeable and influential people in ledge in Sacramento. We thank you for all your advocacy.
Thank you very much.
We talked a lot about the bond, but about the drought, you just mentioned about 15. It looks like the State Water Resources Control Board might be gearing up to do some major steps as far as water allocation and or imposing mandated tiered rates. And I was just wondering what you thought about that, what you know about that. How's excessive use rates jive with conservation?
The question was about pricing structures and how the legislature may, or the administrative agencies may intervene in the local rate setting process. You know, that's going to be really tough. I think in Southern California, there's a number of agencies that have gone to allocation pricing or tiered pricing, and that's kind of like, you know, the model by which folks in Sacramento are pointing to and encouraging agencies to do it on their own. There's reasons, and each agency has their own unique characteristics and their own needs and infrastructure demands. I think we're really going to have to hang together and push hard that this should be a decision of the local boards. You know, don't dictate some broad one-size-fits-all strategy for all water agencies in California. It's going to be tough because, you know, as I said when I opened up my presentation, the drought was a driver for much of what happened today, or happened in 2014. So, you know, the drought's likely to persist. We don't anticipate an end to our troubles in any time soon. So they're going to start taking harder looks at tools that they can impose on water agencies to kind of deal with the drought. I think, you know, as much as you can do at the local level, get the message out, you know, in tough times, people take a personal responsibility to deal with the crisis we have at hand. You know, you educating folks about the value of, you know, conservation and looking at alternative local resources to meet demands is going to be critical to pushing back on any state effort on that regard. I will say, Chair Felicia Marcus of the State Water Resource Control Board, she's a really pragmatic person. And she cut her teeth on the DWP Public Works Commission. So she understands, you know, having to make local projects happen and has an appreciation for that. So I would recommend that, you know, if you see some wave coming towards you that you don't like, you know, she's very approachable. She wants to meet with people. This state board is probably one of the best we've seen in a very long time. And they want to hear from people. They want to get that input. You know, they don't claim to be experts. They need to, you know, help be educated as well as members of the legislature. So it's going to require that we step it up and recognize that rate setting should be left to the locals to deal with their unique, you know, characteristics for their service area.
One final question.
Yeah, hi, Jim Atkins.
Hi, Jim.
I know you didn't cover this in your presentation, but I understand there's been a number of discussions, or there's discussions ongoing about streamlining the CEQA process. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, we tried a couple times. Steve Lamar will attest to that. It's tough. It's a tough one. We actually suggested to Aqua and CMUA and other organizations carry a bill last year to exempt recycled water pipelines 8 miles in length from having to go through a full-blown CEQA process, thinking it's recycled water. The environment's ought to like this, you know, help streamline. And we're not asking for a complete pass. We wanted some accountability and transparency. But having to go through a full-blown CEQA every time you want to do some recycled water pipelines in the street was becoming a little onerous. Didn't get it through. We thought, well, this is going to be a test on whether or not we can really make some CEQA reform happen. Got out of the assembly, but it was not like what we had presented. It was completely rewritten, and actually, in the end, turned out to be, if it had passed, more problems than it would have helped. So we urged the author to pull the bill and not move it forward. CEQA reform is like one of those holy grails in the legislative process. And you know, we're going to have leadership looking at this as impacting infrastructure projects moving forward. But we have to point to real examples too. I mean, that's our requirement. You know, let's point to CEQA stories that are worth telling in Sacramento, because we had a hard time coming up with examples of why it was, you know, difficult for us to move projects forward without some real life case studies, if you will. So there are members, I know a couple that are very interested in it. Whether they're willing to buck the establishment and take on the environmental organizations over CEQA reform, we'll have to see. It's tough. It's a tough nut to crack.
Again, Kathy, thanks for joining us.